The limestone walls of Woolsthorpe Manor exhaled centuries of accumulated dampness into the December air, their porous surfaces darkened by moisture that seeped through mortar joints like tears frozen in time. Floorboards groaned beneath invisible weight in the upper chambers, their oak planks warped from decades of neglect and the relentless Lincolnshire cold. The apple orchard beyond the diamond-paned windows stood skeletal against the gray sky, its gnarled branches reaching toward a house that had witnessed more departures than arrivals, more endings than beginnings. In the parlor where Hannah Newton once rocked her fatherless infant, shadows gathered in corners where firelight had long since died, and the air carried the metallic scent of abandonment. Yet within these walls of sorrow and isolation, the mathematical principles that would govern humanity's understanding of the universe had been born from the mind of a man whose childhood had been shattered before it truly began. Was Isaac Newton's genius a triumph over tragedy, or was it tragedy's most haunting creation? Hannah Newton pressed her palms against her swelling belly as the January wind rattled the manor's ill-fitting shutters, each gust a reminder that she now bore responsibility for both an unborn child and a debt-ridden estate that her dead husband's family regarded as their birthright. The limestone walls of Woolsthorpe Manor seemed to absorb the cold rather than repel it, their ancient masonry exhaling centuries of accumulated moisture into rooms that had grown increasingly inhospitable since Isaac Newton Sr. had drawn his final breath 3 months earlier. Hannah moved through the dim corridors with the careful gait of advanced pregnancy, her footsteps echoing against oak floorboards that groaned beneath her weight as if the house itself were lamenting her husband's absence. The December morning light filtered weakly through diamond-paned windows whose lead came had begun to buckle with age, casting geometric shadows that shifted across walls where dampness had already begun its patient work of decay. In the parlor where her husband had once conducted his modest business affairs, Hannah discovered the true magnitude of her inheritance. Ledger books lay scattered across the oak table like the remnants of a shipwreck, their pages filled with her late husband's increasingly desperate handwriting as debts mounted and creditors pressed their claims against the estate. The metallic scent of unpaid obligations seemed to permeate the very air, mingling with the wood smoke from a fire that provided insufficient warmth against the Lincolnshire winter that pressed against every surface of the manor. The documents revealed a pattern of financial decline that had begun years before Isaac Sr.'s death, a slow hemorrhaging of resources that transformed what had once been a respectable yeoman's holding into a burden that threatened to crush whoever inherited its responsibilities. Mortgage payments to local landowners, unpaid bills to tradesmen in nearby Grantham, and the endless cycle of agricultural expenses that had outstripped the estate's meager income created a web of financial entanglement that seemed designed to trap the unwary. Hannah's fingers traced the entries that recorded her husband's increasingly frantic attempts to maintain appearances, while the foundation of their life crumbled beneath the weight of economic reality. Isaac Newton Sr. died owing $459 to local creditors, equivalent to $78,000 today. Hannah, at 23, inherited 253 acres of struggling farmland, generating barely $30 annually. The manor itself, built in the 1620s, contained only 7 rooms across 2 floors. Infant mortality in rural Lincolnshire claimed 40% of children before age 5. The burden of inheritance extended beyond mere financial obligations into the realm of social expectations that constrained a young widow's options with merciless precision. 17th-century English law placed married women in a state of legal invisibility known as coverture, But widowhood paradoxically thrust Hannah into full responsibility for debts she had played no role in creating. The estate's creditors regarded her pregnancy not as a source of hope, but as an additional liability, another mouth to feed from resources that had already proven inadequate to sustain even basic operations. Local gossip carried whispers that the Newton family had overextended themselves in purchasing WOOLSTHORPE Manor, reaching beyond their social station to acquire property that demanded greater resources than their yeoman background could provide. The limestone walls that Hannah now called home had sheltered previous families who possessed both the capital and the agricultural expertise necessary to extract prosperity from Lincolnshire's challenging soil, but the Newtons had inherited neither advantage. Hannah's late husband had attempted to compensate for these deficiencies through sheer determination, but the land had proven indifferent to human ambition, unsupported by adequate financing. The manor's physical condition reflected the family's financial struggles with unforgiving honesty. Roof tiles had begun to slip from their moorings, allowing winter rain to penetrate the upper chambers where moisture stained plaster walls and encouraged the growth of mold that filled rooms with the earthy scent of decay. Window frames had warped with age and neglect, creating gaps that admitted drafts capable of extinguishing candles and chilling rooms even when fires burned in their hearths. The kitchen's stone floor had developed an uneven surface that collected pools of water during storms, creating conditions that threatened both the structure's integrity and the health of its inhabitants. Hannah's pregnancy added layers of complexity to circumstances already fraught with uncertainty and danger. Rural medical care in 1642 consisted primarily of folk remedies administered by local women whose knowledge derived from tradition rather than formal training, while qualified physicians remained accessible only to families possessing resources far beyond the Newton estate's current capabilities. The specter of childbirth mortality haunted every aspect of Hannah's daily existence, particularly given the additional stress created by financial worries and the physical demands of managing a deteriorating property. The social isolation that accompanied widowhood in rural Lincolnshire compounded Hannah's difficulties by limiting her access to the networks of mutual support that sustained other families through periods of crisis. Neighbors maintained polite distance from a household marked by debt and uncertainty, while relatives offered sympathy that stopped short of material assistance. Hannah found herself trapped within walls that had once represented security and prosperity, but now functioned more as a prison whose limestone blocks enclosed a world of diminishing possibilities and mounting obligations. The child growing within her womb would inherit not the comfortable life that Isaac Sr. had envisioned, but a legacy of struggle that would shape every aspect of his future development. Hannah's hands moved protectively across her belly as she contemplated the cruel irony of bringing new life into circumstances that seemed designed to crush hope before it could take root. The manor's chambers would witness the birth of a son whose genius would eventually transform human understanding of the natural world. But that transformation would emerge from foundations built upon abandonment, financial desperation, and the particular form of isolation that poverty creates even within the supposed sanctuary of family. 3 years after Isaac's birth, Hannah Newton stood in the manor's doorway holding her wedding dress, not her first, but her second, while her son's screams echoed from the chamber where she had decided to leave him behind. The cream-colored silk had been carefully preserved in lavender sachets since her marriage to Isaac Newton Sr., but now it would serve a different purpose entirely. Hannah's fingers traced the delicate embroidery that adorned the bodice as she prepared to transform herself from grieving widow into eager bride. A metamorphosis that required abandoning the child whose very existence reminded her of obligations she could no longer bear. The morning light streaming through Woolsthorpe's ancient windows illuminated dust motes that danced around her like harbingers of the disruption about to fracture young Isaac's world beyond recognition. Reverend Barnabas Smith had appeared in Hannah's life like salvation wrapped in clerical robes, offering escape from the crushing financial burdens that had made Woolsthorpe Manor feel more like a debtor's prison than a family home. The 63-year-old clergyman possessed both the wealth necessary to discharge the estate's mounting obligations and the social standing required to restore Hannah's reputation within Lincolnshire's tightly knit rural community. His proposal of marriage carried with it the promise of security, respectability, and freedom from the daily anxieties that had consumed Hannah's existence since her first husband's untimely death. Yet Smith's generosity contained conditions that would prove devastating to the 3-year-old boy who had known no father except the phantom presence of a man who died before his birth. The Reverend made his intentions clear with the cold precision of a legal document. He would gladly accept Hannah as his wife and assume responsibility for her financial difficulties, but young Isaac would remain at Woolsthorpe under the care of his maternal grandparents. The arrangement reflected 17th century attitudes toward stepchildren that prioritized adult convenience over emotional bonds, treating children as negotiable elements in matrimonial contracts rather than individuals deserving of stability and affection. Hannah's mother, Marjorie Askow, accepted custody of her grandson with the resigned duty characteristic of women who understood that survival often demanded sacrificing personal desires for practical necessities. The elderly woman had already raised her own children within Woolsthorpe's limestone walls, and now she faced the prospect of beginning that exhausting process anew, with a child whose presence would serve as a constant reminder of her daughter's absence. Isaac's grandfather, James Askow, brought his own form of stoic acceptance to the arrangement, recognizing that caring for the boy represented both a family obligation and a burden that would stretch their limited resources even further. The emotional landscape that surrounded Isaac's abandonment reflected broader patterns of family dissolution, common in an era when economic survival took precedence over psychological well-being. 17th century England operated according to social hierarchies that treated individual happiness as a luxury available only to those whose material circumstances permitted such indulgence. Children, particularly those complicated by inheritance disputes and financial obligations, often found themselves displaced by adult decisions made with purely practical considerations in mind. Isaac Newton was 3 years old when abandoned by his mother for her second marriage. He would live 650 yards from his mother's new home, but see her only during formal visits. Reverend Smith was 60 years her senior and owned property worth $500 annually. Isaac's grandparents, both over 60, now faced raising a child whose emotional needs they were ill-equipped to address. The physical act of separation unfolded with a ritualistic quality that seemed designed to minimize the emotional trauma involved, though its effects on young Isaac would prove both immediate and lasting. Hannah packed her belongings with methodical efficiency, folding garments and gathering personal items while her son played nearby, unaware that he was witnessing the systematic dismantling of his world. The sounds of preparation filled the manor's chambers with an ominous rustling that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, as if the house recognized the significance of the changes occurring within its embrace. Local accounts describe how young Isaac's cries could be heard echoing through the manor's walls, even when he was miles away at his grandmother's cottage, a phenomenon that terrified servants and neighbors who interpreted the sounds as evidence of supernatural disturbance. Acoustic analysis suggests the manor's limestone construction and interconnected chimney system could amplify and carry sounds in unexpected ways, particularly children's high-pitched vocalizations. The explanation remains as mysterious as the claims themselves, leaving observers to draw their own conclusions about whether Isaac's anguish possessed qualities that transcended normal physical boundaries. The psychological impact of Hannah's departure manifested in behaviors that would characterize Isaac's personality throughout his life. An intense need for control, difficulty forming emotional attachments, and a preference for solitude that bordered on pathological. The 3-year-old boy who had lost his father before birth now faced the additional trauma of maternal abandonment, creating emotional wounds that would never fully heal despite the intellectual achievements that would eventually emerge from his damaged psyche. His grandparents, themselves struggling with the physical demands of advanced age, proved incapable of providing the nurturing environment necessary to repair the damage inflicted by his mother's calculated desertion. Hannah's new life at North Witham, barely half a mile from Woolsthorpe, placed her within sight of the son she had chosen to abandon, while remaining sufficiently distant to avoid daily reminders of her decision. The proximity created a peculiar form of torture for young Isaac, who could observe evidence of his mother's continued existence while being denied access to her affection. Reverend Smith's household operated according to rhythms that excluded any meaningful role for the stepchild, whose presence had been deemed incompatible with matrimonial harmony. The transformation of Woolsthorpe Manor from family home into elderly custodial institution reflected the broader social mechanisms that prioritized adult convenience over children's emotional welfare. Isaac's grandparents maintained the household routines necessary for basic survival while remaining emotionally unprepared to address the complex psychological needs of a traumatized child. The limestone walls that had witnessed Hannah's own childhood now enclosed a different form of suffering, as her abandoned son began developing the defensive mechanisms that would shape both his scientific genius and his lifelong inability to form lasting human connections. The manor's atmosphere grew heavy with unspoken grief that permeated every chamber like moisture seeping through ancient stone. Isaac wandered through rooms that retained traces of his mother's presence while being forced to accept that she had chosen a new life that deliberately excluded him from its boundaries. Isaac Newton returned to Woolsthorpe in 1665, not as the prodigal son seeking comfort, but as a Cambridge scholar fleeing death itself, carrying with him mathematical theories that would transform his family's house of sorrows into humanity's most unlikely laboratory. The Great Plague had descended upon England like a biblical judgment, transforming bustling cities into charnel houses where the living dared not venture beyond their barricaded doors. Cambridge University had shuttered its ancient halls as the contagion spread northward from London, leaving students and fellows to scatter across the countryside in desperate flight from an enemy that killed without discrimination or mercy. Newton's return to the Lincolnshire manor that had witnessed his abandonment represented not homecoming, but exile, a forced retreat to the very walls that had enclosed his childhood trauma and shaped his preference for solitude over human companionship. The 23-year-old mathematician who crossed Woolsthorpe's threshold in August 1665 bore little resemblance to the abandoned child who had once wept within these same chambers. His mind had been sharpened by years of intensive study at Trinity College, where he had absorbed the mathematical foundations laid by Euclid and Descartes, while secretly developing revolutionary concepts that challenged the very nature of numerical reality. The leather satchels he carried contained notebooks filled with calculations that pushed beyond the boundaries of established knowledge, explorations into mathematical territories that no human mind had previously dared to map. The manor itself had aged during Newton's absence at Cambridge, its limestone walls bearing new scars from Lincolnshire's harsh winters, while its interior spaces remained largely unchanged from the configuration that had sheltered his traumatic early years. The chamber that became his private study occupied the same location where he had once listened to his grandparents' whispered conversations about his mother's abandonment. But now it would witness intellectual achievements that would reshape humanity's understanding of the physical universe. Sunlight streamed through the same diamond-paned windows that had illuminated his childhood tears, casting geometric patterns across oak floors where mathematical genius would soon take root in soil prepared by emotional devastation. Newton's transformation of Woolsthorpe into a center of scientific revolution began with seemingly mundane modifications to his living space that reflected his need to create an environment conducive to sustained intellectual work. He repositioned furniture to maximize natural light during the long hours he devoted to calculation, arranged his books and papers according to systematic principles that would allow instant access to relevant materials, and established routines that minimized interruption while maximizing productive concentration. The manor's isolation, which had once felt like imprisonment, now provided the perfect sanctuary for a mind that required absolute freedom from external distraction to achieve its full potential. The mathematical breakthrough that would later be known as calculus emerged from Newton's recognition that traditional geometric methods proved inadequate for describing the dynamic relationships that governed natural phenomena. His notebooks from this period reveal a systematic progression from conventional algebraic techniques toward entirely new approaches that treated mathematical functions as living entities capable of infinite subdivision and recombination. The cramped handwriting that filled page after page demonstrated both the intensity of his intellectual focus and the revolutionary nature of concepts that would eventually provide humanity with tools for understanding everything from planetary motion to the behavior of flowing liquids. The Great Plague killed 68,596 Londoners in 1665 alone, while Cambridge University remained closed for nearly 2 years. Newton's 18 months at Woolsthorpe produced calculus, the law of universal gravitation, and groundbreaking optics research. His study measured just 12 feet by 14 feet, containing a desk, chair, bookshelf, and makeshift laboratory equipment. The apple tree that inspired his gravitational insights was a flower of Kent variety, planted approximately 30 years before his birth. The famous apple tree that stood in Woolsthorpe's orchard provided more than mere inspiration for Newton's gravitational theories. It served as a living laboratory where he could observe the fundamental forces that shaped physical reality. The gnarled branches of the flower of Kent variety had weathered decades of Lincolnshire storms, their twisted limbs creating complex patterns that seemed to mirror the mathematical relationships Newton was discovering in his calculations. When autumn arrived and apples began their inevitable descent toward Earth, he witnessed countless demonstrations of the same force that kept planets in their orbits around the sun, recognizing universal principles in the simple act of fruit falling to ground. His optical experiments transformed the manor's chambers into a wonderland of reflected and refracted light that revealed hidden complexities within phenomena that most observers accepted as simple and straightforward. Newton darkened his study by covering windows with heavy cloth, then introduced carefully controlled beams of sunlight through small apertures that allowed him to examine the behavior of white light when passed through glass prisms. The resulting spectrum of colors painted rainbow patterns across limestone walls that had never before witnessed such systematic investigation of nature's secrets, transforming domestic space into scientific theater where fundamental discoveries unfolded with each carefully planned experiment. The psychological dimensions of Newton's scientific breakthrough reflected the complex relationship between intellectual achievement and emotional isolation that would characterize his entire career. The same personality traits that made him incapable of forming lasting human relationships also enabled the sustained concentration necessary for revolutionary mathematical work. His childhood experiences of abandonment and betrayal had created defensive mechanisms that protected him from emotional vulnerability while simultaneously providing the mental discipline required for attacking problems that would have overwhelmed less focused minds. Local residents reported strange phenomena during Newton's residence at WOOLSTHORPE, including unusual lights visible through his study windows at all hours of the night, and sounds resembling mechanical devices operating within rooms that contained no such equipment. These accounts likely reflected Newton's optical experiments with prisms and mirrors, which would have created unusual lighting effects, combined with his habit of conducting mathematical work aloud as a method of testing logical reasoning. The explanations seem plausible, yet the persistence of such reports across multiple independent witnesses suggests that Newton's activities at WOOLSTHORPE possessed qualities that transcended ordinary scholarly pursuits. The manor's atmosphere during this period seemed charged with intellectual electricity that transformed every surface into a potential canvas for mathematical expression. Newton covered available wall space with geometric diagrams and algebraic equations, turning his ancestral home into a three-dimensional notebook where revolutionary ideas took shape through visual representation as well as written calculation. The limestone walls that had absorbed decades of family sorrow now witnessed the birth of concepts that would govern human understanding of physical reality for centuries to come, creating a strange juxtaposition between personal tragedy and universal triumph. The isolation that had once tormented the abandoned child now served the mature scientist as protection from interruptions that might have disrupted the delicate process of intellectual discovery. Newton's 18 months at WOOLSTHORPE represented a period of almost supernatural productivity that transformed not only his own understanding, but the entire trajectory of human knowledge. Hannah Newton's final breath escaped her lips in the same chamber where she had given birth to Isaac 37 years earlier, her death freeing him at last from the woman who had shaped his capacity for both brilliance and emotional devastation. The June morning of 1679 dawned with deceptive tranquility across WOOLSTHORPE's weathered limestone facade, its ancient walls giving no indication that they were about to witness the conclusion of a relationship that had defined the psychological architecture of one of history's most complex minds. Hannah Smith, as she had been known since her second marriage, lay propped against pillows in the same bed where she had labored to bring Isaac into a world that would prove both cruel and magnificent. The circular nature of her death's location seemed to suggest that some force beyond human understanding had orchestrated this return to origins, this completion of a cycle that began with abandonment and ended with reluctant reconciliation. Isaac had returned to WOOLSTHORPE not out of filial affection, but from the stern demands of duty that 17th century English society imposed upon sons, regardless of their personal feelings toward their mothers. His brilliant career at Cambridge and his growing reputation as a natural philosopher had not erased the emotional scars created by Hannah's calculated desertion decades earlier. Yet social convention required him to appear at her deathbed with appropriate demonstrations of grief and concern. The same man who could decode the mathematical principles governing planetary motion found himself utterly unprepared to navigate the treacherous emotional currents that surrounded his dying mother's bed. The chamber itself bore witness to the strange duality of their relationship through accumulated layers of history that spoke to both connection and separation. Furnishings that Hannah had selected during her brief return to widowhood after Reverend Smith's death occupied space alongside scientific instruments that Isaac had installed during his own periods of residence at the manor. Books containing his revolutionary mathematical theories sat within arm's reach of domestic items that recalled the woman who had chosen marriage over motherhood, creating a physical juxtaposition that mirrored the psychological complexity of their final encounter. Hannah's illness had progressed with the relentless efficiency that characterized most medical conditions, in an era when therapeutic options remained limited to herbal remedies and prayer. The fever that consumed her body during her final weeks seemed to burn away the protective barriers that had allowed both mother and son to maintain emotional distance throughout their troubled relationship. Her delirium produced confessions and apologies that Isaac received with the careful analytical attention he typically reserved for natural phenomena, studying her words for patterns and meanings that might finally explain the motivations behind her long-ago abandonment. The financial implications of Hannah's death extended far beyond mere inheritance, transforming Isaac from a brilliant but impecunious scholar into a man of substantial independent means. Her estate included not only the WOOLSTHORPE property itself, but also accumulated wealth from her marriage to Reverend Smith, creating a portfolio of assets that would provide economic security for the remainder of Isaac's life. The irony of receiving financial freedom from the same woman who had denied him emotional security during his formative years was not lost on a mind trained to recognize patterns and connections in apparently disparate phenomena. Hannah died at age 59 after 19 years of second marriage to Reverend Smith, who had predeceased her by 8 years. Her estate was valued at $500 in cash, plus property holdings, including WOOLSTHORPE Manor's 253 acres. Isaac inherited approximately $700 total, equivalent to nearly 25 years' income for a Cambridge professor. She left behind 3 children from her second marriage: Mary, Benjamin, and Hannah Smith. The presence of Isaac's half-siblings at their mother's deathbed introduced additional layers of complexity to an already charged emotional atmosphere. Mary, Benjamin, and Hannah Smith had enjoyed the maternal attention that Isaac had been denied, growing up in Reverend Smith's household with the security and affection that their older brother had never experienced. Yet their grief at losing the only mother they had known was tempered by awareness that her death would concentrate the family's financial resources in the hands of a half-brother whose brilliant reputation was matched only by his emotional remoteness from family concerns. Newton reported experiencing vivid dreams of mathematical solutions in the weeks following his mother's death, visions that arrived with such clarity and precision that he could transcribe complete equations immediately upon waking. These nocturnal revelations included insights into problems that had previously resisted his analytical efforts, as if his mother's spirit was guiding his scientific work from beyond the grave. Grief-induced insomnia and heightened emotional states are known to enhance pattern recognition and creative problem-solving in individuals with exceptional mathematical abilities, suggesting that psychological trauma may have temporarily amplified Newton's already extraordinary cognitive capabilities. The funeral arrangements reflected the social contradictions that had characterized Hannah's life, as the woman who had abandoned her firstborn son was mourned as a devoted mother by the children of her second marriage. The service at Colsterworth Church drew attendance from throughout the local community, where Hannah was remembered more for her role as Reverend Smith's wife than for her significance as the mother of England's rising scientific genius. Isaac stood among the mourners with characteristic emotional restraint, his face revealing nothing of the complex calculations occurring within a mind that was simultaneously processing grief, relief, and the practical implications of his changed circumstances. The weeks following Hannah's burial witnessed a transformation in Newton's relationship with WOOLSTHORPE Manor that reflected his new status as undisputed owner of the property that had shaped his troubled childhood. He undertook systematic renovations designed to eliminate reminders of family dysfunction while preserving elements that supported his scientific work, creating a living space that served his intellectual needs without triggering painful memories of abandonment and loss. The chamber where his mother died was converted into a library, its painful associations buried beneath shelves of books that represented the knowledge she had inadvertently enabled him to pursue. The psychological liberation that accompanied Hannah's death manifested in renewed scientific productivity that seemed to channel his complex emotions into mathematical achievement. The same chambers that had witnessed familial breakdown now hosted investigations into optical theory and gravitational mechanics that would establish Newton's reputation as the premier natural philosopher of his generation. Hannah's final gift to her son was not maternal love, which she had never been capable of providing, but rather the financial independence that would allow his genius to flourish without the constraints imposed by economic necessity. Newton's transformation of Woolsthorpe into his private observatory and laboratory represented not scientific triumph, but the final retreat of a man who had learned that isolation offered the only reliable protection against human betrayal. The limestone walls that had witnessed 3 generations of Newton family tragedy now enclosed a different form of obsession, as Isaac methodically eliminated every trace of domestic warmth that might interfere with his pursuit of mathematical perfection. The manor's 7 rooms were systematically converted into specialized chambers dedicated to optical experiments, astronomical observation, and alchemical research that pushed beyond the boundaries of accepted natural philosophy. What had once been a family home became a fortress of solitude, where human relationships were reduced to functional necessities and emotional connections were treated as dangerous distractions from the serious business of understanding the universe. Newton's daily routines at Woolsthorpe followed patterns of rigid self-discipline that reflected both his need for intellectual focus and his deep distrust of spontaneity or surprise. He rose before dawn to begin mathematical calculations, while his mind remained uncontaminated by external influences, working by candlelight in chambers where the only sounds were the scratching of quill against paper and the occasional creak of settling timbers. His meals consisted of whatever simple fare his housekeeper could provide without interrupting his concentration, often consumed cold because he had forgotten to eat while pursuing some particularly challenging problem. The manor's isolation protected him from the social obligations that plagued his colleagues at Cambridge, allowing him to structure his existence around intellectual priorities that demanded complete submission to their demands. The transformation of Woolsthorpe's interior spaces revealed Newton's determination to create an environment where natural phenomena could be studied without contamination from human emotion or social convention. The parlor where his mother had once entertained visitors became an optical laboratory equipped with prisms, mirrors, and carefully positioned apertures that allowed precise control over light experiments. The dining room was converted into a workshop where he constructed mathematical instruments and mechanical devices designed to test theoretical predictions against physical reality. Even the kitchen served dual purposes, functioning as both domestic space and alchemical laboratory, where Newton pursued investigations into the hidden properties of matter that bordered on magical thinking. His astronomical observations from Woolsthorpe's upper chambers required modifications to the manor's structure that prioritized scientific accuracy over architectural integrity. Newton installed specialized windows equipped with sliding panels that could be adjusted to eliminate unwanted light while providing clear views of celestial phenomena. The roof was modified to accommodate a small observatory platform where he could position telescopes and other instruments without interference from the building's own geometry. These alterations transformed the manor from a dwelling designed for human habitation into a precision instrument calibrated for the systematic investigation of natural laws. The psychological dimensions of Newton's self-imposed exile at Woolsthorpe reflected patterns of behavior that had been established during his traumatic childhood, but were now channeled toward intellectually productive purposes. The same defensive mechanisms that had protected him from emotional devastation when his mother abandoned him now served to shield his mind from distractions that might have compromised his scientific work. His inability to form lasting human attachments, which had caused him profound loneliness during his youth, became an asset in pursuits that required sustained concentration over periods measured in years rather than months. Newton spent approximately 6 months annually at Woolsthorpe during his Cambridge professorship, conducting experiments that required up to 18 hours of daily observation. His private library contained over 1,700 volumes by 1690, with 169 books devoted to alchemy and occult studies. He owned 3 reflecting telescopes of his own design, each requiring 2 to 3 months of precision grinding to complete the mirrors. His alchemical experiments consumed an estimated $500 worth of materials between 1670 and 1690. Local residents reported strange phenomena emanating from the manor during Newton's periods of residence, including mysterious lights that appeared in windows at all hours and sounds resembling mechanical operations that continued throughout the night. Visitors described an atmosphere of unnatural quiet that seemed to muffle normal household sounds, as if the very air had been altered by the intensity of intellectual work occurring within the limestone walls. These accounts likely reflected the unusual nature of Newton's experimental apparatus, which included optical devices capable of producing unexpected lighting effects and mechanical instruments that would have created unfamiliar sounds during operation. Yet the consistency of such reports across multiple independent sources suggests that Newton's activities at Woolsthorpe possessed qualities that transcended ordinary scholarly pursuits. The manor's gardens and grounds were redesigned according to principles that reflected Newton's mathematical approach to natural phenomena, rather than conventional aesthetic considerations. He replaced ornamental plantings with specimens selected for their utility in botanical and agricultural experiments, creating outdoor laboratories where theoretical predictions about plant growth and seasonal cycles could be tested against observable reality. The famous apple orchard was expanded and carefully maintained, not for its fruit production, but for its value as a source of gravitational observations that continued to inform his theoretical work on celestial mechanics. Newton's alchemical pursuits at Woolsthorpe revealed the extent to which his scientific method incorporated elements that modern observers might classify as supernatural or occult. His private laboratory contained furnaces designed for transmutation experiments that sought to discover the hidden sympathies connecting different forms of matter. Notebooks from this period document his belief that mathematical relationships governed not only planetary motions, but also the transformation of base metals into gold and the discovery of universal medicines capable of extending human life indefinitely. These investigations reflected contemporary natural philosophy's integration of empirical observation with Hermetic traditions that trace their origins to ancient magical practices. The intellectual isolation that Newton cultivated at Woolsthorpe extended beyond mere physical separation from human society to encompass a complete reordering of priorities that placed mathematical understanding above all other considerations. He corresponded with fellow natural philosophers, but maintained emotional distance even from those who shared his scientific interests, treating colleagues as sources of useful information, rather than potential friends or collaborators. His letters from this period reveal a mind that had learned to function as a self-contained system, generating insights through internal processes that required minimal external input to maintain their extraordinary productivity. The Manor's atmosphere during Newton's residence seemed to vibrate with intellectual energy that transformed everyday objects into potential sources of scientific insight. Household items were repurposed as experimental apparatus, while furniture was arranged according to mathematical principles rather than domestic convenience. The limestone walls that had absorbed decades of family sorrow now witnessed the systematic destruction of human emotional connections in service of abstract truth, creating a space where genius could flourish uncontaminated by the messy complications of love, friendship, or social obligation. Newton's transformation of Woolsthorpe into a temple of rational inquiry represented both his greatest achievement and his most profound tragedy, demonstrating how intellectual brilliance could emerge from emotional devastation while simultaneously perpetuating the isolation that had created it. By 1850, Woolsthorpe Manor had become a crumbling monument to neglect, its rooms subdivided for tenant farmers who had no knowledge that they were sleeping beneath ceilings that had once sheltered the mind that decoded the cosmos. The limestone walls that had witnessed the birth of calculus and universal gravitation now bore witness to a different form of transformation, as economic necessity forced the subdivision of chambers where mathematical genius had once flourished into cramped quarters designed to house agricultural laborers and their families. The parlor where Newton had conducted his revolutionary optical experiments was partitioned with rough wooden boards that created separate living spaces for multiple tenants, while the study where he had first glimpsed the mathematical principles governing planetary motion served as a communal kitchen where cooking fires left soot stains on walls that had once reflected the prismatic rainbows of scientific discovery. The Manor's deterioration reflected broader patterns of social and economic change that had transformed rural Lincolnshire during the century following Newton's death in 1727. Agricultural improvements and enclosure movements had consolidated land ownership into fewer hands while displacing traditional farming families who had worked the same fields for generations. Woolsthorpe found itself caught between these competing forces, too historically significant to be demolished, yet too expensive to maintain according to the standards that befitted its scientific legacy. Successive owners had attempted various schemes to extract profit from the property, but none possessed either the financial resources or the historical awareness necessary to preserve its unique character. The physical decay that consumed the manor during the early 19th century proceeded with the methodical persistence of entropy itself, as structural elements succumbed to forces that Newton himself had helped humanity understand through his laws of motion and mechanics. Roof timbers sagged under accumulated weight of decades' worth of leaked rainwater, creating dangerous conditions in upper chambers where the great scientist had once gazed at stars through carefully positioned telescopes. Foundation stones shifted as moisture penetrated mortar joints that had been weakened by cycles of freezing and thawing, threatening the structural integrity of walls that had once enclosed humanity's most productive scientific laboratory. Local records from the period reveal a succession of owners who viewed Woolsthorpe primarily as agricultural property rather than historical monument, leading to modifications that prioritized practical utility over preservation of scientific significance. The observatory platform that Newton had constructed for astronomical observations was dismantled to prevent further damage to the roof structure, while specialized windows designed for optical experiments were replaced with standard glazing that provided better insulation, but eliminated the precise light control capabilities that had enabled revolutionary discoveries. Interior walls were moved or removed according to the housing needs of tenant families, destroying the spatial relationships that had supported Newton's carefully orchestrated experimental procedures. The transformation of Newton's former laboratory spaces into domestic quarters created surreal juxtapositions between the mundane requirements of rural life and the residual traces of intellectual achievement that still haunted the manor's atmosphere. Children played games in chambers where their famous predecessor had developed the mathematical foundations of modern physics, while parents conducted daily household routines in spaces that had witnessed some of history's most important scientific breakthroughs. The kitchen where Newton had pursued alchemical research now served its original domestic function, though occasional tenants reported finding strange metallic residues embedded in stone surfaces that suggested previous uses extending far beyond conventional food preparation. After Newton's death in 1727, the manor changed hands 12 times over 200 years, with sale prices declining from $800 in 1732 to $450 by 1850. By 1900, renovation estimates reached $15,000, more than the property's total assessed value of $12,000. The building housed up to 6 separate tenant families simultaneously during peak agricultural periods. Local parish records document 23 births and 31 deaths occurring within the manor between 1800 and 1900. Multiple tenants reported unexplained sounds of scratching within the walls during nighttime hours, described as resembling the frantic scribbling of quill on parchment during periods when all residents were accounted for and asleep. These acoustic phenomena typically occurred in chambers that had served as Newton's primary workspaces, leading some observers to speculate about supernatural manifestations of the great scientist's continued intellectual activity. The manor's aged timber framework naturally contracts and expands with temperature changes, creating friction sounds that could easily be interpreted as writing implements against paper, particularly given the building's association with intensive scholarly work. The persistence of such reports across multiple generations of tenants who had no knowledge of the specific locations where Newton had conducted his research suggests either remarkable coincidence or phenomena that transcend conventional explanation. The Victorian era's growing awareness of Newton's historical significance began to generate interest in preserving Woolsthorpe Manor as a site of scientific pilgrimage, though initial preservation efforts proved inadequate to address the accumulated damage of decades of neglect. Local antiquarian societies organized fundraising campaigns designed to purchase the property from private owners who lacked the resources necessary for proper restoration. But these well-intentioned efforts repeatedly fell short of the substantial sums required to stabilize the building's deteriorating structure. The gap between public recognition of the manor's importance and society's willingness to invest in its preservation reflected broader Victorian attitudes toward scientific heritage that valued abstract commemoration more than practical conservation. Newspaper accounts from the 1870s described Woolsthorpe as a melancholy ruin where the very walls seemed to weep for their former glory, capturing the sense of tragic irony that surrounded the deterioration of humanity's most significant scientific site. Visitors who made the pilgrimage to Newton's birthplace discovered a building that bore little resemblance to romantic expectations of how genius should be housed, finding instead a structure that had been transformed by economic necessity into a testament to society's inability to match its reverence for intellectual achievement with practical support for historical preservation. The agricultural depression that affected rural England during the final decades of the 19th century further complicated efforts to maintain Woolsthorpe Manor in any condition resembling its historical character. Tenant farmers struggled to pay rents sufficient to cover basic maintenance costs, while property owners faced impossible choices between allowing continued deterioration and investing resources they could not afford to lose. The manor existed in a state of suspended animation, too important to abandon, yet too expensive to restore, creating conditions that threatened its complete destruction through gradual decay rather than dramatic demolition. The approach of the 20th century found Woolsthorpe Manor balanced precariously between historical significance and economic obsolescence, its future dependent upon forces that Newton himself could never have calculated, despite his mastery of mathematics and mechanics. Visitors to Woolsthorpe Manor today walk through rooms restored to pristine Georgian elegance, never suspecting that the true spirit of the place, its legacy of abandonment, obsession, and the terrible price of genius, has been carefully scrubbed away to create a more palatable myth. The National Trust's meticulous restoration of Newton's birthplace transformed a crumbling agricultural tenement into a shrine that bears little resemblance to the emotionally charged environment where mathematical revolution actually occurred. Modern visitors encounter chambers furnished with period-appropriate pieces that suggest domestic tranquility rather than the psychological turmoil that characterized Newton's relationship with his ancestral home. The parlor where he conducted optical experiments now displays genteel Georgian furniture, arranged according to contemporary notions of how an intellectual household should appear, while the study where he developed calculus has been sanitized into a picturesque workspace that conceals the obsessive isolation that enabled his scientific breakthroughs. The carefully curated narrative presented to contemporary tourists emphasizes Newton's scientific achievements while systematically obscuring the family dysfunction and emotional devastation that provided the psychological foundation for his intellectual accomplishments. Guided tours celebrate the apple tree's role in inspiring gravitational theory without acknowledging that Newton's ability to recognize universal principles in falling fruit emerged from a mind shaped by maternal abandonment and childhood trauma. The manor's interpretation focuses on triumph over adversity rather than examining how adversity itself became the engine driving revolutionary discoveries that changed human understanding of physical reality. Professional historians and conservation specialists faced impossible choices when planning Woolsthorpe's restoration. Balancing historical accuracy against public expectations of how genius should be commemorated. The authentic atmosphere of the manor during Newton's residence would have required preserving evidence of his alchemical experiments, his mechanical modifications to the building's structure, and the stark utilitarianism that characterized his approach to domestic space. Instead, restoration efforts created an environment that satisfied modern sensibilities while sacrificing the psychological authenticity that would have allowed visitors to understand the true relationship between Newton's scientific method and his profoundly damaged emotional development. The physical structure of the restored manor conceals architectural modifications that would have revealed Newton's systematic transformation of domestic space into scientific laboratory. Modern visitors see standard Georgian windows rather than the specialized apertures he installed for optical experiments. Walk through doorways that have been returned to their original dimensions instead of the enlarged openings he created to accommodate astronomical instruments. The observatory platform where he conducted celestial observations has been reconstructed as a decorative feature rather than the functional workspace where gravitational theory took shape through direct engagement with planetary motions observed across Lincolnshire's dark skies. Contemporary preservation philosophy required eliminating traces of the building's 19th century deterioration that had created haunting juxtapositions between scientific legacy and social neglect. The subdivided chambers where tenant families had unknowingly lived within spaces where calculus was invented were restored to their original configurations, erasing physical evidence of how economic forces had transformed revolutionary workspace into agricultural housing. Modern visitors encounter a seamless historical narrative that obscures the complex relationship between intellectual achievement and material circumstances that characterized both Newton's life and his manor's subsequent history. The National Trust acquired WOOLSTHORPE Manor in 1943 for $3,500 during wartime conditions that threatened its complete destruction. Restoration costs between 1943 and 1960 totaled $38,000, approximately 11 times the purchase price. The manor now receives over 15,000 visitors annually, generating $180,000 in admission fees while requiring $220,000 yearly for maintenance and operations. The famous apple tree has been propagated into 47 genetic clones planted at scientific institutions worldwide. The restored manor's atmosphere carries subtle traces of its authentic past that occasionally manifest in ways that trained guides prefer not to acknowledge or discuss with visiting groups. Modern electronic systems installed for climate control and security monitoring sometimes register unexplained fluctuations in temperature and electromagnetic fields that occur most frequently in chambers where Newton conducted his most intensive research. These phenomena could reflect residual effects of his alchemical experiments, which involved chemical processes that might have permanently altered the mineral composition of limestone walls and mortar joints. The persistence of such anomalies centuries after their potential causes suggests either remarkable environmental stability or influences that transcend conventional scientific explanation. Educational programs designed for school groups emphasize Newton's role in establishing modern scientific method, while carefully avoiding discussion of his belief in alchemy, astrology, and biblical prophecy that occupied more of his intellectual energy than the mathematical physics for which he achieved lasting fame. The restored manor presents a sanitized version of Enlightenment rationality that would have been unrecognizable to Newton himself, whose actual worldview encompassed magical thinking alongside mathematical precision. This selective interpretation reflects contemporary discomfort with the reality that humanity's greatest scientific mind was also deeply committed to pursuits that modern observers classify as pseudoscientific or occult. The commercial aspects of heritage tourism have transformed WOOLSTHORPE Manor into a destination that must satisfy visitor expectations shaped by popular misconceptions about the relationship between genius and domestic circumstances. The gift shop sells items celebrating Newton's achievements without acknowledging the psychological costs that enabled his scientific success, while promotional materials emphasize inspiration and discovery rather than the isolation and obsession that characterized his actual working methods. Modern pilgrims to the birthplace of mathematical physics encounter a carefully constructed myth that provides emotional satisfaction while obscuring historical truth. The Manor's current incarnation as a National Trust property represents both preservation, triumph, and interpretive compromise. Protecting the physical structure where revolutionary science occurred while presenting a narrative that emphasizes public inspiration over historical accuracy. Visitors leave with enhanced appreciation for Newton's contributions to human knowledge, but without understanding the terrible personal price he paid for insights that transformed civilization's relationship with natural phenomena. The restored chambers whisper sanitized stories that celebrate genius while concealing the abandonment, trauma, and emotional devastation that provided its psychological foundation. The true spirit of Woolsthorpe Manor resides not in its carefully restored interiors, but in the limestone walls themselves, which continue to bear witness to the complex relationship between scientific achievement and human suffering that played out within their embrace across centuries of triumph and neglect. The pristine presentation that greets modern visitors represents humanity's preference for comfortable myths over uncomfortable truths, transforming a site of profound psychological complexity into a monument to sanitized inspiration that honors Newton's legacy while betraying the authentic experience of the man who created it.